Here's an article that I found pretty interesting. HIV positive Houston man charged in sex assault of Indiana boy. Okay, what happened here, this is from the 16th of March. 49-year-old man, Mr. Sellers, met a 15-year-old boy through the internet and flew him down from Indiana to Texas and then had sex with him for 10 days. Now the prosecution is trying to charge this Mr. Sellers with assault with a deadly weapon for having sex with this boy when he's HIV positive, or at least maybe HIV positive. I think this is very important, this case, because what it would be doing is setting the precedent for you being guilty of an assault crime by exposing someone else to a disease. If you took a syringe of blood and assaulted them with it, that's one thing. But if you're carrying a virus and you expose someone else to it, normally that wouldn't be considered a crime. I'd like to point out that whenever someone has unprotected sex with someone else, they're always taking a risk of not only catching HIV, but any STD, but HIV as well. The risk of catching HIV from one unprotected homosexual encounter where you're the bottom is estimated between 1 in 125 to 1 in 31. The risk of a woman catching it from one unprotected vaginal sexual encounter is about 1 in 100,000. And the risk of a man catching it from a woman in an unprotected encounter, vaginal encounter, is 1 in 200,000. Both people are consenting to have sex, although one of them was underage, but that's a separate issue. And they're both taking a risk. You could have sex with somebody who says they are not HIV positive, who may not even know they're HIV positive, but they could be. Or they could deny that they're positive. In any case, if you do that, you're taking the risk. And I'd just like to compare that to if you have unprotected sex with a woman, and she says she's on the pill and she gets pregnant, you're still liable to pay child support because you both made a decision to have unprotected sex and you both bear the consequences of it. But definitely it's illegal what he did anyway, and he needs to be, taken to court and prosecuted for that as it is. But the issue of having exposed this other person to a disease and being criminally liable for that, that's very significant. The reason they can try to push this in this case, I think, is because, well, for one, it's HIV, everyone's scared of HIV, but nonetheless, you take a risk when you have unprotected sex. The reason they can do it in this case probably is because it was with a 15-year-old. Okay, here's why I think this is really important. Because, for one, the vaccine industry, okay, when you don't give your child a measles vaccine, you're kind of pressured. You're told that you're putting society at risk. If your child gets measles and then other children get it and some of them may die, you're kind of responsible. But up until now, you're not criminally responsible. Let's say I have influenza. Influenza actually has a 1% death rate. So if I get flu and I give it to someone else, that's pretty high death rate. Actually, if you take into account how hard it is to transmit HIV, it looks like you could just as easily be liable for flu because of how easily transmitted it is, even though the death rate is low. You do end up having quite a lot of deaths from it. So that's one thing. If you can hold somebody liable for putting someone at risk of catching HIV, you could possibly hold somebody liable for putting someone at risk of catching flu and possibly dying from it, right? Because they could. And there's another reason why this is very interesting and important. This is from Scribed. I'll put the link. It's called An Integrated Sensor System for the Detection of Biothreats, from Pandemics to Emerging Diseases to Bioterrorism. This is a white paper from Robert E. Carlson, PhD, President and Chief Science Officer, Receptors, LLC. So this is sort of about this is from VeriChip, basically. This was a sensor platform that they developed, RFID device, and here I'll show you the graph. First, it detects whether the virus is present, whether there is virus present in your blood, of an influenza virus, and if so, is it the pandemic virus? And if so, then what virus? H1N1 or H something N something, or SARS or something else? It'd be pretty hard to foist this on the population at this time. People would not be thrilled to receive RFID to detect whether they have pandemic influenza or something else at this time. But if you could make it a criminal offense to put people at risk of catching a disease, then possibly you could have some grounds for either making people want to take something like this, or for forcing it on them. Let's say if you don't take it, you're held criminally liable if you have a disease then, because you neglected to know whether you had it and you put other people at risk. It's possible. Or you could be forced to take it so that then if you have virus, let's say maybe you want to board a plane, maybe you have to go through a sensor, or maybe for some other situations, and then you could be isolated. And if you refuse to comply, then you're committing a criminal act because you're putting people at risk of catching a disease, no matter how low fatality rate. It all averages out. There's a 1 in 200,000 chance of catching HIV, which could then develop into AIDS? Or is it a very high chance of catching influenza with a 1% mortality rate? You see what I'm saying? Okay, that's why I think this case is very interesting, because it sets a precedent, and that could possibly be used to further this agenda of the whole pandemic and vaccines and RFID platforms and all that. Here's another aspect of this. You could go check out this video. It's from a user on YouTube called No to POS. This was an interview. It's called On the Edge, number 3, part 1 of 6 cancer vaccines and animal models. It's an interview between the host, Dr. Jonas Moses, and his guest, Andrew Maniotis, who's a PhD, who works with infectious diseases, and who will talk about some of the problems with AIDS testing, one of them being false positives, that you can test positive for AIDS if you've had more than 2 children, or if you have some other disease like HPV. He says it's only a molecular marker that the test detects. It doesn't mean that you're sick. So if you just get a positive HIV test and from there you're then stigmatized, maybe put on medication, well, that could be a problem.